That chat you did with Lisa was really, really good.
Oh, you liked it?
Yeah. Well, I've liked all of the chats that you do because you just have a really great, calming, matter of fact kind of, like you're not really drawn either way. It's just very, you're not really passionate or in anger or in ecstatic. You're just like, this is how it is. This is what happened. This is where I'm coming from.
Right?
I think also because you're a professional social worker, you kind of speak the language that you just have this sense of authority about you, which is really like it just comes across really, really well.
Well, that's good. Some people don't like that, probably the authority part. But I figure if the goal, well, that's the question. What is the goal, right? Everybody has different goals. My goal tends to be oriented usually towards something like building bridges,
Yeah.
finding points of collaboration, trying to understand where other people are coming from, using terminology that is not going to bring up people's defenses, right? Being right, not using dehumanizing language, right? So trying to find a way to respond to things rather than react to them.
Yeah.
It's it
Yeah,
takes
which
a
is
lot of
actually
breathing work.
so I've kind of noticed I kind of wanted to have you back because last time we chatted, I think you're aware of how crazy some of the trans stuff, like the activism on that front, had gotten. Like you were kind of acquainted with that, but you didn't seem to be as aware of the extreme on the other end. And I really, really want to touch that too much. But having worked at FAIR for a while now, I kind of assume you have bumped into some of the more extreme elements that are pushing back against it. And I kind of wanted to have a conversation with you again with that, like now that you've probably seen both sides of the extremes. Um, and I've kind of noticed lately, like there's the Helen Joyce book kind of narrative where people are talking. This is kind of this wokery and the trans stuff has kind of for most people popped up out of nowhere, um, and trying to then track and find the source of where this has generated from is kind of a normal, natural, understandable thing that people have tried to do. And people have done it in a they've kind of gone looking for official sources, which of course they would. That's what you would do. You would
That's
go looking
right.
for official historical sources. But the trans community is kind of a little bit different on this front because it was a sub community, like, you know what I mean? Like it was a hidden
Hmm.
realm or part of the underworld from, well, from our experience as well. The LGBT up until very least recently was kind of considered underworld-ish. Um, so I've kind of noticed there are two competing history points that get talked about. There's kind of this scientific, medical Blanchard kind of, there's the scientific stuff, that is medical in nature, and then there is the academic stuff, and they are like I spend a fair more time than I should on social media, and they are basically the only two histories that that people talk like. It's really quite remarkable. Like that's the history. It's academia and medicine and nothing else. And it took me a while to kind of slow dawning realize I didn't really pay attention to either of those things. Like as I was coming through, that was not, like the doctors were around and what they thought of this was what they thought of this. But that didn't really impact on, like you would say, yes, 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 even doctor surgery, go kind of not really challenge their view too much. and then leave and never think about what they said about what this meant again,
Hmm.
kind of thing. And there was a very big, especially in the trans man space. Like in Australia, there was FTMA, which is kind of FTM Australia, which was kind of like a smaller satellite kind of situation to the FTM International, which I know you were a part of. Like for trans men that were coming through in the 90s, I presume in the 80s, the 90s, in the noughties, it was very community based. Like people
Hmm.
kind of tended to go to the community groups
Yep.
um, for information and support. So it kind of was like, yeah, there's this weird, you know, the history that is being told about my history is very alien to me in many ways. And I was just wondering about what your take on that is, because I know that you have a kind of similar community style background as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that, you know, coming of age as a young lesbian in the 1980s, going into college in the 1990s, I learned about queer theory, but it was just one of many things I learned. I didn't walk away espousing queer theory, rhetoric. I just didn't. It was just one of. And so I took it in that context. I didn't leave college a postmodernist. I went in a modernist. I've remained a modernist, to a degree. I mean, I'm not ideological about it. And, part of this, and I wonder if it's similar for you, is there's a part of my experience of being within lesbian community and then early FTM community was that we were anti-authoritarian, we were countercultural, right? So this idea of referencing all of these authority figures and organizations that have authority, the American Medical Association, it's like, well, how many physicians do they actually represent? It's like what, 5 to 15% of physicians?
Mm,
Why are they the authority, right? And so I find it really interesting, and I don't recall exactly when the shift started happening that all of a sudden you'd go to we'd go to something like the Gay Pride Festival and it had a sponsor,
yeah,
had some corporate name on it, or maybe the beer garden had a corporate name on it. And I remember when that started to happen, and I was like, that's when I stopped going on a regular basis because I was like, what's happening?
yeah,
And and I think what was happening is that there was this growing frustration that we weren't making enough strides at the municipal levels, right, at the city and the county levels here in the States, and even at the state levels, we weren't making the kind of progress that we wanted to be making on the legal front, right? We had domestic partnerships, but people still wanted to have the same-sex marriage, and we had don't ask, don't tell, but that wasn't the same as open service, right?
mm,
So people were trying to push these things forward. And I think the way they did it was to go through the corporations.
mm,
Let's get the corporations to start expanding domestic partnership benefits, right? Let's start there. And that was a very successful tactic. It really was. But then what that did was it put the LGBT community, or really the gay and lesbian community at the time, in bed with corporations, which was a real head scratcher for me. I saw that it was going to be successful, but I can't say I supported it because I thought there's got to be a better way. Maybe it takes a little longer, but maybe we don't want to sell our souls to the corporations.
yeah,
Um, yeah, so and I also, I dropped out of high school. When I was 16, I didn't go to college until I was 30. So this idea of using the academy, right? Academic arguments and as telling people that what you learn in a queer theory class is just God's gospel, it's the gospel truth. See, for me, that I couldn't embrace it because I had already lived so much life by the time I got to college.
yeah,
I wasn't 18, I was 30 years old. Already served in the military. I had been in law enforcement for a few years. So it wasn't so easy for me to just chew it up and swallow it, and
yeah,
spit it out. I just didn't do that. I think if people I don't know that very many people are doing it, but if people wanted to really learn, if they really wanted to learn from the community, they should mine the FTM Yahoo groups,
Yeah.
which have all been, most of them, I know I was the owner of Bay Boys, the Bay Area
Hmm.
Boys Group, BOYZ. We were contacted soon after Yahoo said, we're shutting these down and we're going to start not allowing any new members to come in. I was contacted by somebody wanting to digitally archive trans Yahoo group message boards.
Yeah.
So I know it's happened because we gave them permission to do that. And so I know that they did that. So I know the information is out there. And I think it's, all the lesbian discussion groups that I went to, the gay youth organization groups that I went to, these discussion-based groups, that's where things were being shared. That was our version of Facebook and Twitter,
Yeah.
were those opportunities. And so when I talk to people and they say, oh, well, this is the history, I'll say, well, kind of. You're
Yeah.
kind of right, but you don't know what influenced that writer, or you don't know what influenced that movement. Here's some of the influence that happened. And because they'll ask me, like, why do you think there's such a push for all this stuff now? And I'll say, well, I think it's a pendulum swing. It's an overcorrection from our gay brothers being disowned by their families as they were dying. I
Mm.
think it's the fact that lesbians were exploited and sexualized in some ways within the mainstream society, more readily being utilized, their storylines in the media, right, in movies, on television series. And so but we were still having discussions that weren't
Yeah.
very public, but we were having similar. I moved all around the country at one point, and everywhere I went, it was almost always a similar kind of conversation that was specific to that region or the cultures that were present.
Mm.
But it wasn't showing up in public, and they don't know that. They don't know that so many people from our community went into ex-gay ministries, or their families sent them to those tough love camps, or they were kicked out on the streets and were doing drugs and sex work as teenagers because their families disowned them and they're estranged from their families. So I'm like, if you know that history and you've lived through it, you can see how then some people might want to be on the rescue, the saving, the protecting side so that that never happens again.
Yeah.
I think it's an overcorrection, but
Yeah. The
I understand if people are
motivation.
motivated by that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They think they're being kind and considerate and protective. And it's like, maybe they are, but you can't leave parents out of this story.
Yeah. You have to give parents the opportunity to, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's very strange. I always
Well,
thought,
and if you think the parents are going to be abusive, then you alert child protective or child welfare services. There's a process for that.
yeah,
They're making the assumption that the families are going to reject them. And a lot of times they're making that assumption based on what a teenager or a younger child is saying, how their family will respond. Well, they might not know. They
yeah,
might just be afraid, but that doesn't mean their family's actually going to respond in a overtly negative way. They might not embrace it wholeheartedly. They might not give the thumbs up to start puberty blockers. But there's a lot of things our parents don't let us do
yeah.
when we're
Yeah,
children.
like it's the start of a conversation. I remember,
Yeah.
like, I had a gay step uncle who apparently told my dad and my stepmom when I was like I met him when I was like 6 or 7, and he was like hello, and apparently told them from one of my earliest ages, like hello community
Mhm.
member in,
That's
in
right. His gaydar went off.
future community member.
Uh-huh.
Um, and and my mum is very like my mother is like, well, I don't know if she's born again Christian, like actively still, like she's still very Christian, but she's very religious. She kind of came in through the hardcore Pentecostal movement, and it's been,
Mhm.
20, 25 years at this point. So she's kind of calmed down, but she's still very full on. So I kind of, but before that, she was always, like I was with her when I met my first lesbian couple that were friends with my brother when I was a kid, and she was very matter of fact about it. Like some people have different lifestyles. Don't worry about it. don't pay it any attention. They're exactly the same, they're the same type. They're human. Don't worry about it. Blah 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 blah. So both of my parents were, you know, not plussed at all. But when it came time for me as a late teenager to start thinking about coming out to them, when I realized I freaked, I thought they'd freak out. I thought I'd be disowned. Blah 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 blah. It was not a big deal at all. Like, even having a hardcore Christian mother, like, it really wasn't the biggest deal in the world. But I really thought it was going to be a massive thing. So,
Well, but nowadays, if you were that young person thinking that that's the response you're going to get, and you went on the internet, you could find people that would welcome you into this glitter family, right? To help you to run away from home to go live with them.
yeah,
You know what I mean? It's
before
like
you even meet them,
because you suspect that your parents are going to freak out.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I've seen heap. I'm on one of the FTM groups on Facebook, and it's a really active group. So every time you log on to Facebook, you see a few messages, and some of the stuff that they just believe everything that they see, and it's like, oh, just completely ditch your family at the first. Like, I think like, I've just come out to my parents yesterday, and my mum's freaking a little bit, and like, it's immediately dumped them. I saw one where it was like this person hadn't even started transition yet, had kind of just earlier that day told their partner that they wanted to explore, like, play around with male pronouns, like start changing over to male pronouns, and their partner, who was like, they were a couple of years into their relationship, was like, oh, this is, I don't know. And it was
yeah.
150 dumper messages straight away. It's like, people are just so reactive about everybody's going to hate you. And it's like, just chill out,
Well,
take a breath.
well, and if they don't instantaneously accept, embrace, celebrate, then dump them. It's like, well, people are going to need some space and time.
Mm,
What I say to people when I do mentoring, I don't do it as much anymore, but when I was doing more of it, I would say, okay, so before you start disclosing to people or coming out to people, I want you to think for a moment right now, how long did it take you to come to terms with who you are and to feel at a place where you were comfortable sharing that with others? And for most people at the time, because they didn't do this in a couple of months like they do now, they'd be like, oh, a year, 5 years, whatever it was, 3 years. And I'd say, okay, at a minimum, give everybody in your life that much time. But if you want to be really generous, double it for them.
mm.
Give people space to adjust, just like you took the space to adjust.
Yeah.
Don't expect, you didn't come to this and accept it overnight. Don't expect others to do that. That to me sounds like really, sound advice. I would imagine that some people would take issue with it right now.
Yeah. Yeah. I did the same sort of thing. Like, well, my partner and my friends were pretty much instantaneously supportive. Um, as soon as I found out transition was possible, my girlfriend and I, or my partner and I, she had trouble with it, but we kind of we got past that. We discussed it at length, and like, took our time with it, etc., etc. But all of my immediate friends were, very supportive. So I kind of had that buffer, but I was kind of like, when I started transition, I was like, like, for friends, if they're still calling me she and using my old name in 2 years, then I'll deal with that after 2 years. And with family, if they're still doing it in 5 years, then that's when I'll have that discussion with them, which is, you know,
Yeah.
open ended, because it didn't, like, none of my friends. I don't think I was ever misgendered, or you know, no one. Everybody just, well, most people were using Kev already because it was my nickname. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, like, I think it took about 18 months for my parents, all of my extended family. So like it didn't take that long, but I remember kind of having that mental, well, this is going to take, it's going to take people some time to adjust and get used to the
Yeah.
reality of this situation. And
Well,
yeah,
but nowadays, that 18 months for some people, they couldn't handle it, right? Their resilience is so low that they're unable to regulate their emotions, to tolerate the distress in their life. So they're going to lash out at other people. They're going to feel suicidal. They're going to be angry at people who don't almost immediately get
yeah,
on board.
yeah,
But it's like I've never corrected any member of my family. Never. And I have 80-year-old aunts that still call me the name that I was given at birth, even though I changed my name before I changed it to Xander. It was something else. They still just call me that. I just don't care. You know what
yeah,
I mean? And people be like, oh, they're transphobic. I'm like, no, they're 80-year-old Mexican women. Like, just leave them alone. You know
yeah,
what I mean? They're Catholic. They're doing their thing. They love me. I know they do, in their way. And that's good enough, because what I like to say to people is, if I were to go around trying to force everybody to change how they think, how they speak, how they act, well, what's going to stop them from trying to do the same? I don't want them to do that to me. I don't want them to try and convince me that I'm wrong and I need to change and I need to behave differently and use, like, I don't want that. So why would I do it to them?
yeah,
Right. So I think just sort of, but if people are looking for validation from external sources, it's because they don't have a good sense of self. Well,
mm,
who doesn't have a good sense of self? Well, a teenager. Teenagers don't have good senses of self. I mean, because they're sorting it all out.
mm,
And that's a really vulnerable time with identity, is in adolescence. But for people who are beyond adolescence, and they're having struggles with who they are and what their identity is, that shows up in borderline personality disorder, right? They just can't get their footing on their self, who they are,
mm.
and so they're trying on things, all these different things, and it's coming up a lot in the detransition community, the number of detransitioners with borderline personality disorder.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, Max and I had a few conversations like the psychosocial thing that you talk about, like the what is it? It's a survey or questionnaire
Oh,
that you think about.
biopsychosocial assessment. So it's an
Yeah,
assessment tool that's used by social work case managers and nurse case managers also, but social work case managers in particular, because it's like, if somebody needs some medical procedure or they need a resource in the community, well, you find out, like, what resources do you need? You need financial resources. Okay, to what degree? Do you have a job? Okay, no. Okay, no job. Do you have any income from anywhere coming in? Tax returns, your parents giving you an allowance? Like, what's happening? So it's
yeah,
like, where are we going to meet you at? Like, you're going to come up to here and then we're going to meet you here, versus, just giving people things without assessing where they are in their life. That takes away their agency.
yeah. I really like that, the psychosocial assessment in terms of pre-transition, like
Mm-hmm.
because it I would imagine you could structure it so that it would bring up you know mental health issues, like you could actually investigate quite fully, because it's not just okay, how do you feel, what's going on with you, and you take
Mm-hmm.
their word for it. Is no, no, let's go through your life in like not a fine tooth comb, like microscope up your backside kind of way, but like let's
Yes.
help you and let's get an accurate snapshot of who you are and where you're
Mm-hmm.
at in your life. And in the process of doing that, I would imagine that it would, like any issues that are lingering are most likely to probably pop up. So if someone is a teenager who is like fixated on transition, any mental health issues, if they're doing a psychosocial assessment, any mental health issues, borderline personality, depression, whether it's a fad, like whatever is going on is likely to be revealed throughout the process of an assessment. Like Max and I were talking about that. I really love that idea.
The one difference, the one variation on that is that teenagers don't get diagnosed with personality
Yeah.
disorders because teenagers just in general have a lot of traits of personality disorders because that's just a natural part of adolescence.
Yeah.
But I'm sure I'm not the only person who knows trans people that traveled across countries and around the world all by themselves and then got surgeries. I know people who traveled from across the world to come to the United States for surgeries like phalloplasty,
Yeah.
and they didn't bring anybody with them. Like, even after top surgery, you're limited in how you can move your arms, and you're on medications, and you've got to go to doctor's appointments, and there's a lot of things you can't do, and you're on your own, and a psychosocial assessment would have determined that they didn't have any support system,
Yeah.
that nobody was traveling with them, because that would have been a big red flag, and it would have given the an opportunity to the local team to muster some local people who could make visits to that person in their hotel room, because
Yeah.
once they leave the hospital they're just in a hotel room, and how are they going to do all the things they need to do if they're laid up in bed, or they have limited access to the use of their arms for a good week or two?
Wow. Yeah,
It's
I hadn't thought like the trans guy that you put me in touch that you mentioned. I got in touch with,
Yeah.
and I've spoken to a few times, and I didn't even think about that. Yeah, he traveled to
Yep.
America by himself. Like,
Mhm. A lot of people do
wow.
that. Yeah, they do that, and
I
and then
I
they
know a
take
few
the
people that
opportunity
have done it.
to play tourist, and then they're not resting. They're they're not right. And
Yeah.
so when people show up and they stop smoking cigarettes the day before their surgery, and then they pick it up again as soon as they're back in the hotel. Well, because nobody's told them that that's going to inhibit healthy healing,
Hmm.
because their blood vessels are going to get
It's
tighter. And yeah, I mean, it's things like that that a biopsychosocial assessment can help with, because you get to determine, like, who are you, where you've come from, what's your experience been like, who's in your world, who's in your life, who can you count on, how do you get to places, how are you getting money, do you have a safe home that you live in, are you is it stable, are you at risk for being evicted, or like, what's going on,
yeah. Yeah.
is your relationship stable? Because too often I've heard stories of people who have lost their partner shortly after they've gotten surgery, especially bottom surgery for trans guys. I don't know how it is for trans women, but for those of us who were in relationships with women who maybe were lesbian identified, there might have been an issue, with, like, okay, wait a minute, now you've crossed a line, but I didn't realize it was a line until you crossed it, right?
Yeah. So heading back to, I kind of wanted to explore because of this historical, there's the science, medical stuff, and then the academic stuff, which kind of, from my perspective, followed, like both of them kind of followed the community. Like the doctors kind of had this idea that gender, or like that you could, that everything was socialization, and they did this experiment, and then they kind of realized maybe not so much. Um, so they had their view, doctors had their view of what transition was, what it meant, what it was for, etc., etc., and that kind of changed over time, mostly. And by the time I transitioned, my endo didn't even really. He kind of told me what he thought this meant, but he didn't try to force that onto me in any way, shape, or form. He kind of just assumed that I agreed with him. Um, and I don't like, a few people had different endos. Most had the same endo, because Australia's not that big. But I didn't get the impression that anybody else's endocrinologist or doctors tried to force a narrative onto them. Um,
Mm.
and that changed as like the doctors changed their tune a little bit as trans people kind of gave them feedback. So that kind of the doctor's view kind of followed. It was very like normative, kind of heteronormative in a way. But that kind of followed a lot of trans person input. And then there's the academic stuff that kind of popped up after the community, and it kind of felt like maybe it was a statement on, oh, we're seeing this stuff happen, let's theorize about it. And when people are recounting the history of how, you know, how trans got enveloped into woke, they're focusing heavily on those two things to the point where I don't really think it's really occurred to people that that's not quite the experience that people had coming through the community. From like I kind of came into community groups and social support networks, and there were resources of this doctor does that. These are the GPs, these are endocrinologists, these are the surgeons that people have used, like resources of how to direct people to the right healthcare people that would actually, you know, help them transition. Um, but in terms of meaning and things like that, people seem to kind of come in with their ideas of what they thought this meant for them personally. They kind of had those ideas fully formed pretty much before they got to the community. Um, and they didn't seem to change that much with, like from their interactions with the community. Like people kind of had very clear ideas of what they thought this was about, etc., etc. And I was just wondering, like, how was like what was your experience with, you know, like the Lou Sullivan group and FTMI and things like that? Because it was kind of all enveloping. Like,
Yeah, I remember, if I think about one particular context, which is the FTM conference. Um, and so, FTMI had a couple of conferences, maybe two, three, four conferences starting in 1995. That was the first one. And then they stopped holding conferences, and another organization called American Boys, or AMBOYZ, BOYZ, they formed, and they started holding a conference called True Spirit. And so the True Spirit conference went on for a number of years. And then when that conference stopped, Zander Keig started up FTM Gender Odyssey, which then became just Gender Odyssey, and then expanded into Gender Odyssey Family and Gender Odyssey Professional. And now Gender Odyssey, the general conference, doesn't even exist anymore.
wow.
So there's no exclusively FTM conference here in the United States. There was FTM fitness. That's now just trans fitness. That's about bodybuilding and diet and exercise and things like that. And then there was a conference for, I think they called it like black and brown trans men, but now that's just trans, right? And so part of the issue is that we used to have these conferences. Now there's things like camping groups and retreat center things that are just exclusively, and they're not even FTM anymore. And that's part of the issue, I think, is that I went to Gender Odyssey. My first time there was FTM Gender Odyssey. Second time, I believe, was FTM Gender Odyssey. When I came back the next year, it was just Gender Odyssey. And the reason for that, I believe, I wasn't in the decision-making part of this, but I was a volunteer at the conference, and I heard the grumblings, and that was that we started getting genderqueer people. They didn't call themselves non-binary, right? Genderqueer people coming to the conference, and a couple of trans women came, and they were dissatisfied with the fact that there were no workshops for them. And it's like, yeah, it's an FTM conference. All the other 50 conferences that are going on in the country are for you. This is our one conference. But eventually they started getting their own workshops, and then there were all these more genderqueer kinds of workshops. And my response to that was maybe the second year that that happened, I was going to these workshops at this FTM conference, and there were all of these people in these workshops pushing back on, they weren't using language like you're binary. They were just saying, and they weren't saying toxic masculinity. They were just, maybe they were using heterosexist or, heteronormative. They were using that kind of academic language. And I was like, you know what? We need a space for men to sit together and have a conversation. And I went to the organizer of the conference. This was in Seattle, Washington, here in the States, Gender Odyssey. And I said, listen, I noticed that at this particular time, that particular room has no workshop in it. Can I do an impromptu workshop? And he said, yeah, what do you want to do? What are you going to call it? And I said, I want to call it the men's room, and I want to make it exclusively for people who we didn't use language like identify as men, but I wanted it for people who lived their lives as men, is what I said, in society. And I said, I'm going to sit there and I'm just going to see who shows up. Well, I mean, like 30 or 40 guys showed up. They were across age groups. They came from all over the planet. Yeah. There were people from all over the world at Gender Odyssey. They came in, all different races, right? Ethnicity. So it wasn't just a bunch of middle-aged white guys from the States. It was this, and I thought, and they were all like, thank you so much for doing this, right? Because we still need to be able to have these spaces. And so I think part of the issue is that I'm uneducated in the sense that this isn't something that I think happened because of a formula that somebody wrote down. I think it just sort of rolled, and what I think happened was more and more clinics started opening up. So more and more people had access to hormones. More and more groups were getting started all around the country, online with Yahoo, and at the LGBT community centers, they were starting discussion groups all over the country, and these conferences were happening, and people started to meet each other, right? So between 1995 and 2005, people were just starting to learn, oh, I'm not the only one. There are other people in my state. There are other people in my country, right? Other people in my city. And they started connecting with each other. FTM International helped them connect all over the world. But it was small little pockets here and there. And once the community started to grow and our access to things started to expand and the places we could go started to increase, well then, and the way it was happening, right? We went from, as people would say, like an excessive kind of gatekeeping to, like a spindle door, kind of process. Like we overcorrected, I think, in that respect too. And so I noticed, it was probably around 2000, when would it have been? Maybe around 2012. I was living in San Diego, California, and I was just about finishing up with my social work degree. And somebody started coming to the FTM group at the center, at the LGBT center in San Diego, in Hillcrest, the more near downtown area of San Diego. And they were talking about how they thought that they had made a mistake starting testosterone. And I said, what do you mean? Because I had never met anybody who had ever said that before. We weren't have the word detransition. And they were saying, well, I don't want to become, and then they went off on this stereotype, a notion of a man, and I was like, well, you don't have to stop testosterone to not become that kind of man. Just don't become that kind of man. Like, you have full say in what kind of man you become.
Yeah.
You can become, you can become a jerk, or you can enter the priesthood. You can become a father. You can, go drive a big pickup truck, and, you can do whatever you want, basically, for the most part. But if you don't want to become a particular kind of man, don't do it. The testosterone's not making you become a particular kind of man.
Yeah.
And they kind of looked at me like, Nobody had ever said that to them. And they said, when I went to the clinic, they didn't explain anything to me. They just they just wanted, they just gave me the hormones. And I was like, they didn't make you do a 5-year plan, because that was part of the procedure back then at this one clinic in San Diego. And they say, yeah, but I didn't know what to write, so I just wrote a bunch of stuff.
Mm.
Right? There wasn't a lot of, at least in their case, they said there wasn't a lot of oversight on having a discussion with them about, okay, so in 5 years' time, you'd like to be doing this, or you'd like to be this, this far in your
Yourself, yeah.
transition. Right. And so I think that's what started happening is people started doing lone wolf transitions. So they weren't coming into the community,
Mm.
and they were just going to clinics that had very low, access points,
Oh,
and so they were getting access to, I mean, life-changing hormones. Testosterone is a very powerful. Testosterone gave me this and my voice and made me lose all my hair. Like, testosterone is a powerful, powerful drug.
mm.
And to not know enough about what it's going to do, and to be sort of prepared for all the unknowns that are going to be happening. But I think that might be a key piece, Kev. I think that most people are uncomfortable and don't know how to navigate with uncertainty. And I think transition brings a lot of uncertainty, and it requires a lot of patience. And so we have people who don't know how to deal with uncertainty and are very impatient. And it, by nature, most adolescents are impatient and don't have the skills to navigate through uncertainty, which makes them much higher risk of realizing that maybe they made a mistake in transitioning. Maybe they were just a gender non-conforming woman who may or may not be lesbian or bisexual, right, or pansexual, or any other words. They immediately went, on a
Yeah, I wonder
on a
about like
journey with gender.
the culture in general, like when like the culture in general has kind of followed that trend, like not thinking things through, instant
Yeah,
gratification, like,
yeah,
like this is definitely like the culture has shifted just in general, society towards instant gratification and not fully thinking things through, and nothing is ever anyone's fault. Like, you do something stupid and everyone around you is like, oh, no, 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 that you're not to blame for that. Like, we've kind of gone, we're kind of a bit too easy on everybody, in
yeah.
the scope of being nice. I've kind of been thinking about that a lot lately. But I kind of am wondering, like, I'm seeing, so there are people that are transitioning because they think they see the boy phase, like the early 2 years of first 2 to 3 years of transition, where you're very boy like and you're teenagehood and it's kind of
Mm,
cool and groovy. And if you're young, you're not necessarily thinking that's a phase that will end. Like,
yeah.
you don't get to stay there. That's a phase that you move through. Um, they're kind of thinking, oh, that's cool. I want that, without having. I don't know whether it's people
Mm.
not
Like
spelling
Peter
it
Pan
out.
syndrome.
Yeah, people not spelling it out to them, or them not have finishing the
Oh,
thought.
you know what I think? A lot of this, I think what's happening is, do you remember when there was all of a sudden, there were everywhere you turned, you were hearing people say, not trans enough. People are telling me I'm not trans enough. I'm not doing trans right. And it's like, are people actually saying that to you? Or are you walking into a space and seeing a bunch of grown ass men, and you are early or not even starting your medical transition, and you feel out of place?
Yeah,
Is it you or is it them? Are they actually saying to you, you don't belong, you're not doing it right? Sometimes that happens, but I think generally speaking, right? And so then they would leave the group, and then they would try and figure out how to do it on their own. And inevitably, they'd be sort of piecemealing it together.
yeah. And
And then,
if they had walked up to those people that they felt intimidated by and went, I feel really intimidated, they'd probably get all the support that they could possibly want. But if they don't
yes,
broach the gap, then they're not going to know. I kind of
Yeah, I
wonder.
mean, with all of these, like with FTM conferences being gone, with a lot of these face-to-face FTM groups, like not even really happening anymore in a lot of places. I mean, I can remember one day when I was at Gender Odyssey, the conference in Seattle, and I was sitting at a table with about 4 or 5 other guys about my age, about the same length of time in transition, and there was this teenager because they had the family conference, and so they brought their kids. So the little kids were in like a camp kind of room, and the teenagers were having their own workshops, but they could come over to our conference. We just couldn't go to theirs. They wanted to keep us separate. And there was this one teenager, and he was just sort of hanging around, and he was sort of looking at us, and he kept kind of moving a little bit more closer and closer, and he was like listening to us. And so I looked over at him. I said, "Hey, buddy, you want to come sit with us?" And he's kind of looking around. I'll go, "Yeah, you want to come sit with us?" And he's like, "Okay." And he comes over, he's like this lanky teenage kid, 15, years old. And he sits down and he's looking at us. And I'm like, "Yeah, you got some questions?" And he's like, are you all trans guys? And we were like, "Yes, we are, little man," And
Yeah.
he's like, "Wow." He's like, "I'll be right back." And he went and got like 4 or 5 of his teenage buddies and brought them back because they actually wanted to learn. They wanted to like, what's it like living as a man? They were boys,
Yeah.
right? They were teenage FTMs. They wanted to know what it was like for us. We were in our 40s. What was it like for us?
Yeah.
And I don't see that happening. I haven't had that experience in a many years happening.
Yeah.
There's not a like mentorship is it exists, but it's so hit or miss with being able to. I have a mentor. I mentor other people. It's a part of the culture that I really wish there was more of that.
Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of that in the former community, like in the old community groups. Like you would like for me, it wasn't so much mentorship, it was connecting with other people who were at the same point in
Oh,
transition
sure. Yeah,
as
yeah,
me,
yeah.
who had similar outlooks that were, just doing their thing, living their life. Transition was something that we were navigating, trying to do it as sane as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I did that too, but I thought I want to connect with people that are like 10 years ahead of me in transition. They've been through everything. They've been through all the holidays. They've been through family, breakups. They've been through changing jobs. They've been through, changing where you live, right? In that point of 10 years of life, you've been through so many things. So it's like, okay, they've navigated all the things that I've yet to navigate. So I want to be able to ask them questions along the way. For me, it was Jameson Green. I approached him and asked him if he'd be my mentor. He said yes. We still
yeah,
talk all the time, and it's a wonderful relationship to be able to have. And we've become friends. We've collaborated on projects. We've presented together. We've published a couple of books together. It's one of those things. I don't see that happening
mm.
as much.
I
There's
kind of
almost a disregard or even a disdain
yeah.
for those of us who are just living as men, as if now there's something, well, to use their word, problematic.
Yeah. I kind of wondered, and I'm seeing this with younger trans guys, mainly on Twitter, is where
Mm,
they'll talk about it. They they're trans guys who are like similar to you and I, you know, will be fine, etc., etc. But they've transitioned in a time period where there's this theory that you must,
mm,
you know what I mean? Like you have to be in the community to access anything in the community. It kind of seems like they feel like they must comply, and they
mm.
don't believe it, but they kind of they seem to be very torn by it. And I kind of have started to wonder, like, yes, there are a lot of people transitioning unwisely and then detransitioning, and that's a separate cohort, like a definite
Mm.
cohort. But I also wonder, like with some of the people, and there's one of them kicking around at the moment that I'm kind of watching and watching him kind of struggle back and forth to try and figure out, because he's barely 20, only just turned 20. Um,
Mm.
talking about, like I transitioned, I thought it would be one thing, it has turned out to be another. I've kind of gone too far now. Like I'm never going to be able to live as a woman again. So that's, kiss that goodbye. But like this is uneasy kind of, like I wanted I think I wanted to detransition. I'm not sure. Like I want to get real about this, and I kind of wonder. Like, yes, the detransition thing is definitely part of that, but I also wonder if there's a slice in the middle of people who transition correctly under the wrong mindset, and they're kind of waking up realizing that what they thought was the case like wasn't, and now they kind of have to
Mm,
figure it out on their own for the first time in their lives with no support networks and no Yahoo Twitter of people that they can get online at any point and talk to a group of like-minded people who will encourage them or give their 2 cents, like where you go, hey, listen, like this has happened and I'm not sure how to conceptualize this. Shoot off like email to the Yahoo groups, and suddenly, generally within 10 or 15 minutes, you get, like four,
yeah,
five, six, 10 dozens of,
yeah, yeah,
responses of people going, hey, listen, it'll be okay. Or, you know what I
yeah,
mean? Like all of that stuff that used to happen where it was like, listen, I've been through this, and you'd have like half a dozen people respond saying, I've been through this, this is how I dealt with it, or you know what I mean? Like I kind of wonder
hmm,
some of the regret, like there's the detransitioners, and then there are some of the regretters who have already transitioned a bit too far to fully detrans that are struggling with how to, like, where to go from here. And I kind of wonder
mm,
if they can conceptualize, like, you transitioned and that's one aspect of your life. It doesn't have to be everything. You can just be a trans man, like moving through the world. You can be open and honest and you know kind of conceptualize it a little bit differently, come to terms with it, and then still lead a completely happy, productive, fulfilling life. Like, yeah,
yeah,
been wondering
yeah.
about that a lot lately.
Well, I mean, for sure, I I was under the impression when I started testosterone, when I started the medical transition, that it was going to it was going to relieve me of some of the issues that I had been encountering up to that point, right? The just blatant public homophobia,
Mm.
right? And that's true. It did do that. I mean, not immediately, of course. It took a little while before my appearance changed enough. Um, and it's like, yes, it did solve for that issue. It brought other issues that I could not have predicted because, well, I had never lived as a man.
Mm.
Even though I was often mistaken for one and called sir since I was 15 years old, immediately people would correct themselves as soon as I started talking.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the perception of me as male was fleeting, even because I was just very masculine. So, I mean, but we only know what we know. And so, yes, I did solve for that issue, but then I gained some new issues. And the question at that time was, okay, so now I have a new set of issues. What am I going to do about it?
Mm.
Right, because they were new issues, so I wasn't worn down by them. I wasn't ready to give up because of them, right? I was just sort of like, these are the new issues. But I was also like in my early 40s, right? I started testosterone when I was 39 years old. I don't know what would have happened if I did it at 19 or 29, um, and so the ability to have a certain level of maturity to mediate all these uncertainties that are going to be coming, right? How am I adjusting to the medications? How am I adjusting to the new role that is expected of me? All the expectations that come. How am I adjusting to how my world is changing?
Mm.
And um, what kind of messages that I'm getting from people, right? The pro, the con, and you know, there's a saying in the New Age community, wherever you go, there you are,
Yeah.
right? And so the idea is I can change how I look and sound. I can change how I dress, which I didn't. I always dressed the same way, right? That's the advantage of going from a dyke to a dude. Right. But once all of the sort of fanfare, the boyishness of transition, once that all is settled and all that wears off, then it's sort of like, oh, here I am
Absolutely.
living my life. And well, it turns out I still have some of the same things that I have to grapple with interpersonally and intrapersonally. And so, okay, let's get to work on that. But for people who don't have the wherewithal, the skills, the temperament, the resilience to do that work, I would imagine that they're going to be struggling more, right? So this idea of if wherever you are, wherever you go, there you are. It's like if you are anxious before transition, you will be an anxious trans person, right? If you have OCD, you're likely to continue to have OCD, right? If you have addiction, you're likely to carry on with that addiction, even if you're in recovery, right? You're just in a different phase of your addiction.
Yeah.
So, but I think people, it's not a panacea, right? It's more like a Pandora's box than a panacea. It really does open up a bunch of things that we might not be ready for, but we have to deal with it. And if we don't have the skills, the life experience to deal with it, we're going to struggle. I remember for me early on, once I was being viewed as a man everywhere I went, I noticed that, things got a little rougher. I always felt unsafe as a woman, but I've never been more unsafe than as a man, right?
Yeah.
Because there's this roughness of men around in public. And I remember thinking, I don't know how to navigate this. I don't know how to navigate man on the street interactions. And it took me a while to figure out how to do that, because I wanted to look at everybody and smile, like you know, my
Yeah.
female self,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, that's not going to go over so well. And then people started calling me, boss and big guy and boss man. And I was like, what is that? What is that an insult? Is that a term of endearment? Like, why are people all of a sudden calling me things like big guy and boss man and boss? So I just started asking random men that I knew, do people call you boss? What do you think it means? And they're like,
Yeah.
people are calling you boss. And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, oh, that's a good thing. And I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, I'll take your word for it. But
Yeah.
it's like, I didn't know anything about that. And so for people who might be uncomfortable, it's like I was an androgynous lesbian, and then I was a genderqueer, early FTM genderqueer person. And then once I started to look and sound and be seen and be treated as a man, well, for me, the path of least resistance is almost always where I'm going to go.
Mm.
And so if people see me as a man, treat me as a man, then I'm just going to live as a man because it's going to take so much time and effort and energy to constantly be saying,
Yeah.
you should know, and then this, like, I just don't have the time and it's nobody's business really.
I found something really interesting about, because I out myself pretty much. Like all of my friends know, um, when I start a new job, within a few months, I'll, when it's relevant, I'll tell people, because you spend most time, especially as a chef, you're working like minimum 50 hours a week. You spend more time with these people than anybody else. And I make a lot more sense as a whole person if people know I'm a trans guy, because I'll break out into Spice Girls songs in kitchen just to amuse myself. And like I don't really monitor my, like I'll just do what I want, kind of. And it doesn't
You be
really matter
you.
how ridiculous it is. I will do it if it's amusing. um but yeah, it's interesting because at a certain point of transition, when you tell people, they like, and it does, like I've tried to tell people so many different ways, like casually sit them down. Like it doesn't really matter how I tell them, like which method I deliver the news. They all kind of want to sit down and what do you want me to do with this information? Like what response? And it's kind of like, oh, I just want you to know, like it's just
Yeah.
a drop into a conversation. I know you don't care, blah 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 blah, but it kind of is,
Mm.
sometimes like I like people to know, and I'll out myself, but in some situations, it's like it's just really like it's not worth the emotional effort
Hmm.
of investing into this situation. You know what I mean? Like because
Yeah.
people still kind of are at the stage where they don't really care, but they feel like they kind of need to do something to make, you know what I mean? Like they need to, there's an action or something they
Oh,
need to do
well,
to make it
I think
okay. And
what's
it's like,
happening is out in the world, they're hearing these messages of, we're living our authentic life and we want people to, you know, see us and hear us and believe us and acknowledge us and welcome us and celebrate us. And so, people are getting the message like, oh, this is really serious.
yeah,
This is something that I'm supposed to care about and pay attention to. And so it's probably a shock to them to hear somebody say, oh, by the way, I'm trans, hand me the skillet. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like it's one of those things where, and I'm that way too. I'm very casual about it. I don't want a big deal made out of it because I don't think it's a big deal. But I don't need any external affirmation or validation at all.
yeah,
I'm solid. I don't need any of that. And I never have. I've always been that way. That's just my default setting. I didn't ask for permission to be a lesbian, and I'm not going to ask permission to be a trans guy. And I didn't need people to accept me as a lesbian. And I don't need people to accept me as a trans man. Like, accept me or not, I don't care. I'm moving in the world here.
yeah.
Just get out of my way.
This thing is happening regardless. Like, yeah,
Yeah,
I'm very similar.
yeah. It's like if you're not on board, that's fine. Or maybe to 30%, 40%, whatever. Just don't get in my way. I don't care if you're standing on the sidelines. It's you do you because I want to do me, right? It's
Yeah,
just a continuation of a similar theme, which is if you don't accept me, that's fine with me. It doesn't impact whether I accept myself or not.
yeah. It doesn't really
Self
change.
acceptance it's not, for me, it's not attached to external acceptance.
Yeah,
And that's because, I mean, if you think about Kev, at least in this country, maybe it's the same in your country, in that, we've had the laws change in the last, 10 years, right? That we could serve in the military, we could get married, we could, there's a lot of laws that changed, but I spent most of my life living in a country with laws that were not in my favor and members of our community, right? The GLBT or LGBT community. So nowadays, people, I think they just maybe they don't realize, they don't know what it was like to live where, I served in the military before Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That was what they called the witch hunt days. I was
yeah.
serving in the military when you had to hide who you were.
Mm.
Don't Ask, Don't Tell was lasted for quite a while, from like 2004 to 2011 or something. So, well, I mean, not that 1994, I mean, to 2011. So that was a long period of time. The experience of the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell was not the same as Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And now people who are in the military under open service, it's a very different reality. And so we should be taking into consideration that people who are younger didn't live through those time periods and they might not even know about those time periods. And so they don't have a sense of how really wonderful things are now
But yeah, and they also,
comparatively.
I've been watching Pose, which is
What's that?
it's one of it's basically a ritzy TV show by the guy that made American Horror Story, about the
Oh,
ballroom
okay.
culture. So it's basically the Paris is
The
burning,
what culture?
the ballroom drag
Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
trans
Uh-huh.
culture.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I watched Paris is Burning, and then I started watching Pose. Um, and I mean, it's kind of very glamorized and a bit unrealistic in a lot of ways, but it also has kind of reminded me about what it was like even in the early 90's coming out, and like the support groups in Australia, in Sydney, were run by a gay and lesbian youth hostel, like a homeless youth charity. So I
Mm,
was around a lot of kids that had been booted out of home, and it kind of as watching this stuff has kind of reminded me of what it was like,
hmm.
because it's so easy to forget, like you're just living your
That's
life,
right.
your reality changes slowly day by day, and suddenly you're 20
Hmm.
years into the future looking back and forgetting so much. Like it kind of almost is 2D, rather than like your own history is kind of like 2D, and you forget so much of the reality of your day-to-day life. But like it's kind of set in 82, so it's like
Mm,
the AIDS crisis is kind
yep.
of taking off, um which is something
Yeah.
that I like.
Back then it was the gay cancer.
Yeah, like I kind of came in 93, 94, so it was kind of at the tail end of that, so
Yeah.
I knew a
No, I was there
few.
through all of that. I lost
Yeah,
so many friends to AIDS.
like, but
In
it,
the
it
80s.
it really wasn't that long ago, but and it's kind
Nope.
of one of those things, like from when you were born, or when you come of age, that's your reality, that's your normal, and you don't
Mm-hmm.
really anything that happened before your time is very 2D. You don't really, you know what I mean? You don't really think about it or play it through fully, and the people that you hear stories about don't
Well,
seem
but
very
then,
real
but
to
then it's
you.
also, since they don't know it existed, or if they do learn about the history, there can be a sense of so what, right? And I've met people over the years that are half my age. They'll call themselves a pioneer. I'm like, of what?
Yeah,
Well, I was the first trans man that came out in my town. It's like, okay, so you're a pioneer in your podunk town, but the
yeah,
pioneers are people who have already gone. They're no longer living. What they had to live through compared to what we're living through, they made it possible for the next generation, the next generation, the next generation to be. And so I have always been very much into knowing our history and plugging into the history. That's what FTMI was for me, was plugging into the history. When
yeah,
we founded the Lou Sullivan Society in San Francisco, when we disconnected from FTM International at that point, right, was to honor Lou Sullivan, who was the person who founded FTM San Francisco, which became FTM International. So
sure.
we wanted to go back to the source. But he wasn't the first one, right? There were trans men down in Southern California in a more conservative area called Orange County that had been doing support groups for trans men in their community for probably 5 to 10 years before that.
Yeah.
Right. And so you had people like Jude Patton and some others that were doing that stuff back in the 70s,
Mm.
and the 80s. Right. And so it's one of those things where I think it's helpful for people to know what the history is,
Yeah.
so that that doesn't mean that you just sort of rest on your laurels and don't try to make change anymore. It just means you kind of know, like, okay, who's come before, what did they do, what has been achieved, what still needs to be achieved, and then let's work on that,
Mm.
right? And maybe that will dissipate some of the anger and some of the, I feel like I don't run into people who espouse these kinds of things, but I feel like I get messages from other people who are like, look at what this person has tweeted, because I'm not on Twitter, but people will send me things, and it sounds like they think they're living in some sort of like, Armageddon time for trans people, right?
Yeah,
They'll
they
use
really do.
words like, we're being terrorized, it's a genocide, people are trying to eliminate us, and I'm like, really? Where? Like, if you're not on Twitter, you don't see that.
Yeah.
And I just see normal people. I engage with people all the time and all across the political spectrum and the religious spectrum and the social and the socioeconomic. And I don't hear anybody talking that way.
Yeah.
It's, maybe Matt Walsh is making comments about, body mutilation and how trans people are immoral. I don't think he's going to have that big of an influence
Yeah. I
on
saw
what happens to us,
Helen Joyce and Julie
Mm,
Bindel did a chat about
mm.
whether TERFs should work with people in the right wing, which was an interesting
Well,
discussion.
that is interesting because that happens. It's interesting bedfellows. But here's the thing, it's like if they're a standard conservative, I don't have a problem with that. But if they are on the ideological right, that's where the problem is. Your everyday standard conservative in the United States is not a white supremacist, right? But the ideological right are the ones that I'd say stay away from. But I'd also tell people stay away from the ideological left,
Yeah.
not the liberals, but the ideological left, right?
Yeah.
And there is a difference between the ideological as ends of the spectrums and the liberals and the conservatives and the moderates or centrists, between them. It's I think there was a study done not that long ago. I think it was done in Britain, but it was about the United States. And they discovered that it's about 15% of our population, adult population, that are on these ideological extremes. So there's about 5 or 6% on the ideological right, extreme right, and there's about 7 or 8% on the extreme ideological left.
Yeah.
But those voices are the ones that the algorithms were lifting up in Twitter. I'm thinking that must have changed now, and they're not getting the same kind of visibility that they used to get. And so that's going to change what people see, right? A new algorithm, because those voices were being elevated beyond what the actual scope of that audience is.
Yeah. It was really
And I
interesting.
think that really that
You,
I think that impacted people in a really bad
oh,
negative way.
so like people have wound themselves up. Like this is a really
Yeah.
important issue. Like I'm not going to say that this is like, transitioning kids, it needs to be done, well, transitioning teenagers needs to be done, if it's going to be done at all, very, very carefully, very thoughtfully, very
Do
slowly.
it like the
Like,
Swedes do it in the
you know,
Finnish. Do it
like,
like they do it.
but this is population wise, this is, like it's not the biggest, you know, existential threat to humanity. Like it's a big problem. I'm not going to say it's not,
Yeah.
but like people have wound themselves up on, like I know people on social media that literally live this day in, day out. They spend hours a day discussing this. Like, they go into all these little theoretical nooks and crannies and they convince
Yeah.
themselves of all sorts of things. Um, and it's really interesting. You'd love the first 5 minutes of the Julie Bindel Helen Joyce chat. Helen Joyce, they do opening statements for 5 minutes, and Helen Joyce's statement for 5 minutes was bang on the money. She's like,
Mm.
like most people exist in the middle. Like
Yeah.
most people are, like some version of, fiscally or socially conservative, or, fiscally or socially liberal. Like people aren't exactly one thing or exactly the other.
Yeah.
Like the
Yeah.
people that are in the extremes always think that they have everybody, that everybody agrees with them because, everybody
Well,
that
and if you don't, you're wrong.
yeah, everybody that they are around agrees with them, so they think that they
Yeah.
have the majority, and
Yeah. They don't.
everybody always thinks that they're right. And like the way that she talks about, like that opening statement was just brilliant, because it's
That's
like
awesome.
most people are not in the extremes. Like most people don't
Mhm.
have any clue about,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was
No, I completely agree. I think that my hope is that as things change, because the way change movements happen, right, is there's like a big lead up to something, and then there's like a big kind of like this is our moment, let's do it. They just really take advantage of the energy, the time, whatever the issue might be. And then ultimately things start to taper off again because people go back to living their life. And so the people that are all wound up are going to find themselves over a period of time in a smaller and smaller and smaller group.
Yeah.
And then hopefully their life will take on new dimensions and they'll just move on, because otherwise, I mean, people who are really wound up by this stuff, these are not people who are going to be very well, right? They're not going to have physical wellness, mental wellness, emotional wellness. They're probably not sleeping very well without medications or without some sort of drug, over the counter or not, that they're having to take for sleep. It's like sleep is a good indicator. If you're not sleeping well, then you're doing something wrong, right? Sleep is the indicator for if your life is going in the right direction, if you're healthy, if you are taking care of yourself. um, that's something that people should be paying more attention to, is they're sleeping. Because if I do sleep seminars for my corporate clients now, because it's one of the most important things and they all want to learn about it. And I say, listen, if you're not getting enough sleep and you're not getting up at the same time every morning, your circadian rhythm is dysregulated. And if your circadian rhythm is dysregulated, then so is your appetite, your mood, your endocrine system, your blood sugar levels. Right? If your circadian rhythm is dysregulated, everything else in your body is dysregulated. So you're going to be more vulnerable to illness. You're going to be more sensitive to other people's, statements and postings. You're going to have more mood fluctuation. You're going to have more weight gain, because your appetite's going to be so off the charts, and your ability to regulate your weight is going to be disrupted because you're not sleeping properly, right? You're not getting proper sleep. And so it's like, it's all good and well to be a teenager filled with angst, you know, banging on the drum, walking down the street, making noise and making change. But when you get into your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and your 50s, and if you're still banging on about things, there's probably other things in your life that you are neglecting. Your relationships, your body, your job, your home, as this will get me canceled for sure. But as Dr. Jordan Peterson says, make your bed.
That's cool. I'll let you go because I know you've probably got something booked afterwards.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course, Kevin. It was wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much
Yes,
for all the work you're doing. I'm not on social media, so you're taking it for the team, all that Twitter reading you're doing.
mostly I lurk, but yeah, it's interesting. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out over time, because these things never end the way we think they do. And logically, there is only so much governments can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we need to
Have
be.
you noticed a difference in Twitter with the new ownership?
Not really, not yet.
No, I mean,
There
as
was
far as what you're seeing, has the vitriol sort of dissipated a bit, or?
No, it's kind of the
Mm,
well, I follow mainly gender critical turf type people,
okay.
or trans people or chefs. So
Yeah. Yeah.
when Elon took over, there was a surge of men can't be women posting that got quite graphic. And
Mm,
then on the other side, we're having a genocide,
yeah.
stochastic terrorism. That was a big thing for a couple
Oh,
of
for
weeks.
gosh sake.
But yeah, no,
Overreaction. Yeah.
it hasn't settled down. But Twitter is designed to, the whole platform is designed for people setting their hair on fire and going online.
Hmm.
That is the rub.
Yeah.
But yeah, it will
Yeah.
be interesting to see what happens, because people are not they're thinking about what they want personally for their group, and they're not really thinking about the principles that underlie, you know
Mm,
what is the best way to negotiate this, moving forward forever. Like that doesn't,
Well, one thing I've wondered about over the years is like, there are people that come into the trans community who have never been part of the GLBT community until they transition.
mm,
And so they don't know our culture, right? So for those of us who, went from like gay man to trans woman, or lesbian to trans man, and bisexuals, even if they're part of the community, we know the history, we know the vernacular, we know the culture, we know the resources. So when you have people who come in who are just coming in from the outside and then expecting everything to change, it's sort of like, well, we used to get angry at the people who tried to do that,
mm.
but now it's almost like a stampede into trying to change everything, from people who have never been part of our community. And I don't even know how much they were involved in advocating for us, to advance socially and legally before they transitioned.
Yeah,
Like how much of a stakeholder are they in our community over, if they're in their 40s or 50s, what did they do in their 20s and 30s? Were they advocates for our community? Were they anti our community? Were they just ignoring us? Like, and now all of a sudden we're supposed to just embrace them. Come on in. Oh, and now you want to change everything? And it's like, we were doing pretty good.
there certainly is a dynamic of having, and I this is language that I would never ever really use in any other situation, but people that were in the straight world that had like a
Mm-hmm.
certain amount of prestige and privilege, not quite understanding the history of the LGBT community being kind of, like part of the underworld, or the cultures that have developed over time from that, kind of coming in expecting to be expecting to transfer the same levels of
Oh,
prestige, etc. over. Like there is a theme of that you see through, I
mm,
deserve. You see lots of
that's
I deserve
interesting. Yeah.
everywhere, not just in our community, but yeah, it's kind of everywhere at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really wonder. I also wonder what kind of resources are going to be available to all of these really young trans people who went on blockers and then took the cross-sex hormones in their adolescence, and they've never really been part of a community, because they've been, sequestered off and protected by their families, kept away from us, and then all of a sudden they're going to be adults and they've always been trans because they started so young. And then they're going to encounter people like me and you and others who are, our age, that are just starting their transition. And it's like, I
Yeah,
think it's really a completely different community.
yeah.
But I don't know if they have those resources. Are there like millennial trans groups? You know what I mean? For,
I don't know. I would
in
hope
Gen
so, but
Z.
I haven't seen
Yeah.
any.
Yeah. Because I think maybe they're just now entering into their 20s, a lot of them,
Mm.
right? Because we started puberty blockers, here in the United States, broadly in like 2007. So
Yeah,
if they were like 10, 11 years old, like they're just now entering into adulthood, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
Scary times. I worry about a number of things in relation to that. You know, like how how are you gonna, like, what social skills do you develop in that situation? Like,
yeah. Well, I think it's just your average, like, how do you as a human being develop the social skills? But you have to be able to, in addition to the normal kind of maturation and social skill development, is you have to figure out how do you negotiate your body in relationship to other people as you're getting into that part of your life where you want to be in intimate relationships, you want to have a partner, right? You want to maybe get married. So it's like, how do you negotiate how people see your body, respond to your body, how your body works, which is going to be different. I don't know that we've prepared, and I don't think the solution to that is to, um, you know, taking kids to like stripper drag queen shows, to expose them to sexuality. But it's like we have to figure out, and I'm hopeful that somebody's going to figure out in a responsible, age appropriate way with these teenagers or these young adults, maybe, like, how are you going to talk to somebody about your body? How are you going to negotiate dating? How are you going to negotiate being sexual, being intimate with people? I don't know if I mean, no teenager's really prepared for that, but there's still the expectation of you look this way, but your body says something different. And so people are going to be like, wait, what's going on over here?
Yeah.
you know? And how are they going to deal with that so that they don't fold inside, and have their self-esteem trampled all over, but they also don't lash out at those people as being, transphobic, or even calling them chasers because they want to be interested, they're interested in being intimate with them. So it's like how to navigate that in a really, emotionally mature way, which, is a stretch for teenagers, young adults, right? You gain that over time.
Yeah.
I don't know who's talking about these issues in a way that's not exploitive.
I don't think that has really been. I don't think giving kids blockers and then letting them transition beyond, oh, we're being kind, has really been thought through logistically at all. Like, you know.
Well, I think, we took our cue from Norway and Sweden, but only partially, right? Yes, they put minors on blockers and then they put them on cross-sex hormones. However, they did a much more thorough screening and evaluation process. They looked at the psychosocial stressors. They looked at the family support. They looked at the comorbidities of their mental well-being. They looked at all of those factors. And if you weren't stable enough, they didn't put you on blockers. Here in the United States, they got to a point where they would put kids on blockers just to help them navigate their distress with their body or their gender dysphoria. It's like, but without really knowing, like, yes, of course, maybe the family was involved, but like, what's the bigger system, How are they really going to be able to handle that, emotionally, mentally, cognitively, right? They're going to rely on their parents a lot. They better be there for them.
Yeah, I think that it looks like I don't know much about this area in particular. From what I've seen, I think it is just been left up to, we're just being kind and we'll leave that up to the families. And it's like, even at the level of you're biologically male or female, you present as the other, you have been that for as long as you can remember. So your biological reality is a deep, dark, distant memory. You're now an adult. You've kind of been coddled quite heavily and, presumably been given almost everything that you want. Like, how does that prepare you for adult life? Like,
well, I mean, part of the issue is that we're a very large country we don't have a centralized healthcare system. So how things are being doled out across the United States is just inconsistently.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, why wouldn't it be, right? We don't even have, our healthcare isn't even by the states. It's our employers. So, it's like if my employer and my wife's employer both had the same insurance company that provided us with an insurance plan, they'd probably be different because it's up to how your company negotiates your plan. So it's very different. It's by person. So it's different when you go to these other countries, in Scandinavia and Europe, where they have nationalized, right? Or in Canada, regionalized healthcare systems where everybody's in a database. We don't have that here. The closest you can get to that in the United States is our Department of Veterans Affairs, our Veterans Health Administration, where all the veterans across our country are in one database, and they can track how many transgender veterans there are, and they can do all kinds of research based on that, and they can look at that information. But that's only adults. There's no children, of course, because you have to be at least 17 with parental consent to join the military, and most people come in when they're 18.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where we don't really have the same ability to gather up those numbers, gather up the data in that way. We have mostly, kind of snowball research where we're just putting up surveys on the internet and hoping that people are going to fill them out.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wonder about that with a lot of the numbers that people are throwing around, especially about in the States. Oh, there, this is happening and that's happening, and these detransitioners and these trans kids and
Mm.
surgery, regret and blah 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 blah, and they're throwing out numbers, and it's like, they, how does that work? Like, where are these numbers coming from? Are they solid? How could they possibly be solid if there's no
Yeah.
national system, like,
Well, if you look at some of the European countries, Scandinavian countries that have everybody in one system, Sweden did a longitudinal, data dump, and they looked at like from 1973 to either 2003 or 2013, like a
yeah,
whole long period of time, and they had low levels of detransition. Well, guess why? Because they screened people from the start.
yeah,
So when they say, oh, we had 1%, we can't claim that here. We don't know if that's true or not.
yeah.
There is a trans man who's a professor and a principal investigator doing detransition research up in Canada, where they can grab up information by the regions. And so they're finding it's much higher than 1%.
Yeah.
He's like, I know a couple of people have detransitioned. Everybody I know knows a couple of people. Like, it's happening,
Yeah, there's
in
no
much
doubt
bigger
it's happening.
numbers than, and people will say, well, lots of people have regret. You can look up the research. It says, people who had knee surgery, how much regret did they have?
20%.
And so they'll use that
Yeah,
also as, there's always going to be regret. So they want to dismiss and marginalize the people who detransition as outliers. And it's like, well, but we're all outliers and we don't want to be dismissed. So why would we dismiss people who are outliers? Because we don't want to be dismissed. I don't it's a total hypocrisy to
and
me.
there's a significant difference between knee surgery
Well, yes.
and SRS. Like, it's
Yeah.
quite significant. Like, they are not the same
Yeah.
thing. And
Well, that's why I like what Kinnan Ross McKinnon, the professor, the researcher up in Canada at York University, he's doing the work and he's coming out with research and he's publishing it. And, we'll see how people respond to that. It's still just Canada. He's not doing the United States. So somebody's got to be willing to take up, you know, the research on people who have, detransitioned, who have stopped, whatever. You have to figure out how we have to figure out how to use all the terms possible to capture everybody because not everybody says detransition.
yeah,
So
yeah, no, it's
yeah.
crazy, crazy times. Anyway, thank you so much for chatting.
You're welcome.
I'll let
You're
you go.
welcome. Okay. Thank you.
Take care, Chief.
You too.
I'll chat to you
Bye.
soon.